Good afternoon, and thank you everyone for joining us for this special occasion, having Scott McCorquodale come to Pullman to talk to us about his career as a wildlife biologist. I'll give a quick intro for Scott and then hand it over to him. After his talk, there'll be time for question and answer. And then we'll have, if you're interested in getting a copy of his book, his books are here. He's happy to sign for you. And also plenty of in-person sweet and savory along the back wall. So please help yourself to anything that looks tempting. Scott McCorquodale spent 40 years as a professional wildlife biologist, starting out in Montana, then working extensively in the state of Washington, where he currently lives. Having earned degrees from the University of Montana and the University of Washington, he has carried out field research on grizzly and black bear. He received the Washington State Department of Fish and Wildlife's Director Award and Best Science Award for his contributions to wildlife conservation and management. He is recognized statewide and nationally for his contributions as a leader in the wildlife profession. While he has published more than 25 peer-reviewed scientific papers, several book chapters, countless agency reports, and popular magazine articles, this is his first published book. Please join me in welcoming Scott McCorquodale to talk about chasing wildlife secrets.
Well, thank you, Linda, and thanks to WSU Press for putting on this event and the great collaboration we've had on putting this book out. So I really appreciate their help. So yeah, my goal, I guess, coming into this today was to give you some context for the book, help you understand sort of what's in it, but not in a way that would make you not want to read. So, so I'm going to try to walk that line. We'll see how that goes. So the obvious first question that I often get is, so why did you write this book? And so before I say why I wrote this book, I'm going to say a couple reasons why I definitely did not write this book. Did not write this book to get rich. So I think if you want to write a book and get rich, you should write a novel, and it probably should be a romance novel or a spy thriller. But this is nonfiction, and it's a little bit of a different world. But it was never a money-making venture for me. That was not part of the equation at all. I also didn't write it because that my professional journey was exceptional compared to other wildlife biologists. I think every wildlife biologist probably has a pretty interesting story to tell. I just decided that I was willing to do mine. And so that's not a reason it's the reason I didn't write the book was not to sort of pat myself on the back and say, you were really better than the rest. Like, I'm not. I'm really not. So the real reasons I wrote it, there were more than one. So I found over the course of my life, particularly my adult life, that people are really interested in wildlife and natural resources. There's a high level of interest. People, if you see the kinds of cable shows that are on and magazines and all that stuff, I mean, people are really interested in this. But as a profession, I don't think we did a very good job, as I was doing this job, at communicating to the public about what we do. I found that a lot of times when I was talking to somebody about the science or how we collect data or what the data, what we interpret the data to mean, most of the time it's because they wrote me an email or they called me on the phone and they were mad about something. They didn't like what the agency was doing. They didn't agree with the data. And so I was always kind of in a defensive mode, trying to explain to people, how this worked, what we were doing, what we were trying to do, what it meant. And so I thought, well, what if you didn't do it that way? What if you initiated the conversation rather than be the responder? I think wildlife biologists and government natural resource people are really pretty good about responding. They're just not as good typically about starting conversation. So I thought this book was an opportunity to try to do that, to try to, outside of the emotional laden context of a conflict conversation, to just help people understand what it was that this work was about. The other reason, the last one that I'll mention is, working as a scientist for 40 years, I did a lot of technical writing, and I even was an associate editor for a journal for a long time. And technical writing is a lot different than creative writing. Technical writing, it's all about being concise, precise. And I can write a journal article, which I did many times, about work I did and things that we learned from that work, and publish it. And the journal editors are totally great with me telling the story of what it was we learned. Nobody would ever let me tell how I felt about what I was doing while I was learning that thing. And I enjoy writing, and I've been told that I do it fairly well, I guess. And so I just saw this as kind of a chance to step outside the technical writing box and talk about this stuff, talk about this work, the nature of this work from a very, very personal perspective, and be as emotive as I want it to be. So anyway, those are really the kind of the reasons that I took on this task. So where did it begin? Well, it began with this book, I think. So this is a book called Wild Animals of North America, published by the National Geographic Society in 1960. I was born in 1957. I was like 3 when it was published. And I didn't really own this book, but my neighbor did. And it was a neighbor who I would often take care of me. My parents both worked. Sometimes if I was sick and couldn't go to school, I would go to their house. And I found this book on their bookshelf. And I would go and every time I went there, I'd pull it off the shelf and I'd pour through the photos and the paintings and artwork in here, even before I could read any of the words. And I was just fascinated with the book and was kind of wearing it out, I guess, a little bit. And one day on one of those visits, the neighbor said, "You know what, Scotty," is what they called me then. "We think you enjoy this book more than we do. And we want you to take it home today, and it's your book from now on." And so I eventually learned to read and started reading all the species accounts in here. And I started trying to memorize all of these natural history facts about these animals. And I didn't know that there was actually a job, wildlife biologist, but I knew I wanted to be a wildlife expert, even as 7 or 8-year-old. So I think that's where it started. In this book, and in many of the other publications of the National Geographic Society about that time, you would find the work of these two guys pretty prominent in the 60s. And anybody know who those guys are? John and Frank Craighead. So they were twin brothers, and they are most famous for starting the first ever detailed study of grizzly bear biology in the lower 48 states. In Yellowstone National Park in 1959 is when they started. Most of the tools that they would need to do that work didn't exist in 1959. So they were like cutting edge, learning everything from scratch. And I found their story very appealing. Again, I didn't know that the job that they did was actually a job. I thought maybe they were like two very special people and only people like that got to do this. But I was fascinated by that, and particularly by the work with the grizzly bears. So that kind of put me on the path. I really initially, when I started to pursue this, I thought I would be a grizzly bear biologist. I wanted to be a grizzly bear biologist. So I ended up, John Craighead was the Cooperative Fish and Wildlife Unit leader at the University of Montana in Missoula during that time they were doing this work. Frank ran a private research thing that they had created at Wyoming. So I thought, well, I went to high school in Montana, and I thought, well, maybe I should pursue this by going and enrolling at the University of Montana, which is what I did. with the support of my wife, who's here today. And we'll talk about her in a little bit. So when I got to the University of Montana, and the reason I have this slide in here is because probably like most people, I think, the success I had and the things that I accomplished weren't entirely because of me. Like there were people along the way that did things for me, gave me advice, and had a significant role in sort of pushing me down the path and helping me to grow. And these three gentlemen in particular are ones that I wanted to mention. The one on the left is not a really well-known name. Probably you won't recognize him. His name's Les Pengali. It's actually named W. Leslie Pengali, but he went by Les. And he was the chairman of the wildlife biology program in 1979 when I got there at the University of Montana. One of the very first classes I had as a first-year student was a required class for every first-year student. And in it, we had a guest speaker one day from the Forest Service. And he got up, a podium much like this, looked around the room, said, looking at all these faces, said, look around. Almost none of you will ever work as a wildlife biologist. You should change your major. There's not that many jobs. I was like shocked. And so Les Pengali was the head of the program. He was not my assigned advisor, but I made an appointment to go see Les that week. And I sat down with him and I was just honest. I said, I'm really passionate about this, but I mean, am I spinning my wheels here? I mean, should I go do something else? And he sat there and kind of smiled at me, didn't say anything right away. And he said, no, I think if you are willing to work hard, you can make this work. And you advised me to, as part of my plan, probably think about getting a graduate degree right away, as soon as I got my bachelor's, which is what I did end up doing. But he, maybe more than anybody else on my path, is the most responsible, I think, for me becoming a wildlife biologist. The gentleman in the beard at the top right is a guy named Chuck Jonkel. And he actually was running a grizzly bear research project at the University of Montana in 1979 when I got there, called the Border Grizzly Project. And I got my first experiences with, as a volunteer, working with folks that were part of the Border Grizzly Project. And Chuck was just a real amazing guy. He took a real interest in my life and my professional development, my academic achievements, and what I was doing at the university. And he was just a big influence. And I feel like I need to say that. The guy in the bottom right, if you're not a mammologist, you'll never have heard of this guy. This is a guy named Philip L. Wright. He was a mammologist and was the primary mammologist at the University of Montana in the late 70s when I got there. He had already been there a while. His class, mammalogy, was known by all the students as one of the hardest classes in the entire curriculum for a wildlife biology degree. It was also known that if you could get an A in his class, he would write you a recommendation for graduate school. But there aren't very many A's, everybody was told. And so I worked really, really hard in Dr. Wright's class. I got my A, and I got my recommendation for graduate school from him, and it was very influential. So those are three folks early on in my career that really had an impact. Another guy that I'll mention, and he actually wrote a book a little earlier than I did, maybe a year earlier than I did. He wrote this book called Grizzly Bear Science and the Art of a Wilderness Life. His name is Bruce McClellan. He was one of the grad students on the Border Grizzly Project. And he was actually a Canadian. He was going to the University of British Columbia. But he was the person that I had my first field experiences doing research with wildlife. It was in the summer of 1981. Just after my junior year, and I went up and spent a good part of the summer with him and learned an awful lot about field research. And I'm really grateful. He's a really cool guy, very, very smart. His book's a bit different than mine, but you still might find it interesting. And so this is a photo of me that summer, North Fork of the Flathead River, just west of Glacier National Park, 1981. And that's the very first animal, that black bear, It's the very first animal I had any role in capturing for a research project in wildlife. Um, and it was so long ago that they didn't even put stuff on hats. They just give you a hat with hats and nothing. So there's no logos or things like that. So I thought I would be a grizzly bear biologist. I was on track. I'd gotten involved with the Border Grizzly Project a bit. I was learning things. I sort of was getting everything I could out of that. But as I approached graduation in 1982, a really unique opportunity jumped up in front of me as I was exploring schools to go to for my master's degree. One of the ones that I was looking at was the University of Washington. It was a place that I could get a graduate degree and my wife could finish her undergraduate degree, which is kind of what we were shooting for. There weren't a whole lot of schools that would do both of that for us. And so I was asked to come over and interview and meet with the faculty at the University of Washington's wildlife program, which was embedded in the forestry school. I went over there and they pitched this project to me that I knew was a pretty big deal. It was about an elk population. The winter of 1972-73, for the first time in modern history that anybody knew of, 5 or 6 elk showed up on the Hanford site near the Tri-Cities. Treeless, hot summers. They were there in the winter. Everybody thought they'd be gone by the next spring, but they weren't. They were still there, and they were still there the next winter and the next spring. And pretty soon people realized, I don't think they're going anywhere. I think they're staying here. But what was really unique about them is they were doing something that everybody that knew anything about elk said they could not do. They weren't supposed to be able to live in a hot, treeless place because of certain bioenergetic considerations. So I knew that this was really unusual, this opportunity. I also knew it would probably be really easy to publish the results in journal because it was so unique. So it was really hard for me to turn it down. And so grizzly bear one day, looks like it's going to be out for a while now. And so I enrolled at the University of Washington as a master's degree student and started this project on the part of the Hanford site known as the Arid Lands Ecology Reserve. Wasn't where any of the nuclear stuff had happened. It was just sort of a buffer zone that had been created for some communities. And these elk were doing, nobody knew what they were doing. Like nobody knew how they were doing things that they weren't supposed to be able to do. And so I was the very first person to have the opportunity to get in there on the ground and start studying them. And we just kind of started trying to unravel this mystery. There were 27 elk in that herd at the time I started in 82. The last survey was done just a month or so ago, and it's now 3,000 and some elk in the Hanford population. But I was there right at the beginning, and it was really cool. So, anybody know who the guy on the left is? That one might. That's Aldo Leopold, probably best known for Snap County Almanac, and also regarded generally as kind of the father of modern wildlife management. He was a professor for a long time at the University of Wisconsin, and prolific writer, great deep thinker about ecology. The guy on the right was going to be my major professor at the University of Washington. His name is Dick Tabor, and he died in 2016. And when he died in 2016, he was the last surviving graduate student of Aldo Leopold. And so, not saying that I have the same pedigree as these two gentlemen, but it's still pretty cool to think that you were part of your training in your profession in wildlife as a wildlifer was from somebody who was trained themselves by Aldo Leopold. Like that was a pretty cool thing. Dick was a great mentor. He always asked tons of questions. Every time I would get him an answer, he'd say, "Okay, but what about?" And that would always lead to more ponderings and work. So anyway, it was those are two other people, particularly Dick, directly that had a big influence on me. And so this is what it looked like. This is where these elk were living, and there were no forests. There were no trees really of any kind. We were making it up as we went. in the latter years of my career, I flew a lot with very specialized, highly trained wildlife pilots. The guy in the left seat here in the orange suit is a crop duster from Basin City. He'd never done anything wildlife. And we just contracted him. We asked him if he would consider chasing elk with us. And he said, hey, that sounds like fun. Let's do it. So the gear is all wrong. There's no flight suit here. There's no helmet. We were just sort of seat of the pantsing it. And that's all, that story's all in the book. Pretty in depth. So we went, set out and started catching elk, putting collars on them so we could follow them around and start trying to figure out what was going on. Because they weren't seen very much. There were a lot of people in Hanford that knew they were there that had never seen them and had been looking for years. So we needed to be able to find them. Radio collars were the best bet. And so I spent several years just running around this cool reserve. There was nobody else doing anything else on the reserve at the time. Like it was my personal research playground, 120 square miles of nearly pristine shrub steppe, chasing these elk around, learning something new and amazing every day. And so that went on for a while. After I finished my degree, I was hired briefly by Battelle, which is a contract with the Department of Energy at Hanford, and I continued to do some elk work and deer work. And then again, one of these things just happens that you didn't see coming. Got a phone call one day, 1988, from a guy who had been a PhD student of Dick Tabor's at University of Washington. He studied elk at Mount Rainier, and he ran the wildlife program for the Yakama Nation. And he called me up and he introduced himself. I had heard his name before, but I had never met him. And he said, I just was able to secure a large grant for a 3-year study of black-tailed deer in the McCorquodale Basin, down by Goldendale and Glenwood and places like that. He said, I need somebody to run it. And I was hoping that person would be you. And so there were some things going on at Hanford that were a little dicey in terms of funding at the time. And so this seemed like a good time to think about taking another lane. And so Kim and I talked about it. We went up and visited there, and then I took the job and it was supposed to be a 3-year job. I ended up being with the tribe for 13 years. Just kind of kept building on work where it was really successful. It's one of the longest deer projects ever done in the state of Washington. I think we were in the McCorquodale for 6 or 7 years. A lot of graduate student projects took me a couple of years. So it was kind of a really cool opportunity, and we learned a lot, and we fulfilled all the objectives of the project. So that's how I ended up sticking around Central Washington. And there's one of the traps we used to use on the McCorquodale to catch deer. And there's one of our marked deer racing away from a trap after we marked it. And so we finished that project, and by then we'd been able to talk to the Bureau of Indian Affairs, who had funded the deer project, into considering extending the grant and broadening it, not just deer. And so we'd answered most of the questions we had about deer in the McCorquodale, but then I had a lot of questions about elk again, and there hadn't been any really research done on the reservation on elk. And so we started doing an elk project on the reservation and following those elk wherever they went. So a lot of them didn't end up staying on the reservation. Did that project for several years. It was going really well. And Bill Bradley, the guy that had hired me, he came to me one day and he said, the work you're doing with the elk population, he said, I think there's enough complexity there that I could see this as a PhD project for you. And that kind of scared pants off of me. But anyway, I went home, talked to Kim. She actually thought it was a great idea. Thought it would create new opportunities in the future. So back to Missoula. We took our 3 kids, moved back to Missoula for a year so I could do the coursework for a PhD. Still employed by the tribe, and then went back and ended up getting my degree in 2000. So there was a little break between my master's and PhD, but kind of that's how I ended up doing that, and didn't really see it coming. But one of the cool things about working with the tribe is it kind of created another opportunity for me to kind of move in and work with bears. Um, the bear density on the reservation, I could tell just by doing deer and elk work, was really high. Like tribal members hunted deer and elk passionately, but not very many hunted black bears at all. And so we were running into black bears all the time. Saw them on aerial surveys or helping here all the time. And so I talked to Bill Bradley about it and said, we could probably learn some stuff that would be interesting and useful. And he said, well, if it doesn't interfere with the elk project, go for it. And so we ended up, I ran two large research projects, one on bears, one on elk at the same time. And I got back to some of the skills I'd learned from Bruce McClellan in the North Fork of the Flathead. Started using cubbies and trapping bears and covert traps and trapping bears, following bears to their dens, collared bears, just trying to sort out reproduction and age dynamics and things like that. So it was a pretty cool chance to get back to doing that. And we caught bears, a lot of bears, had a lot of bears, and we marked a lot of bears. And every once in a while I would get one of my kids to come out with me. This is my daughter, Katie, who has her own little kids now, but this was her one day when we caught this black bear that she cradling their head there. And so I had this 13-year stop in Toppenish to work for the tribe, was going along pretty well. And in 2001, another opportunity opened up, which was a really appealing job with the Washington Department of Fish and Wildlife. It was to be their statewide deer and elk research coordinator and lead, and that was very appealing. And the nice thing about it was they said it would be fine if I worked out of the Yakama office and lived near Yakama. So I didn't have to move for this job, but I would get sort of a bigger pie to work with in terms of wildlife research. So I applied, I got the job, and until I ended my career when I retired, I was an employee of the Department of Fish and Wildlife. And for several years, I did a lot of, led these research projects on deer and elk. At the time I joined the agency, we had several deer projects that were underway. They were mostly collaborations with universities. So the deer thing was pretty well covered at the moment and it was going pretty well. But there was a lot of stuff that we didn't know about elk. And so that was kind of where I got directed to put some attention on. I did still do deer work. This is a picture of when we were relocating some Columbian whitetail deer from one place to another to try to increase their range. So I was still doing deer work, but not a big project like the Klickitat. But elk, I was chasing elk projects all the time. Took me to lots of different places in the state. Also did a few things that weren't researched, like that bottom right corner photo. That's myself and a game warden named Mike Hobbs. And we're dealing with a little yearling bull elk that had decided he'd rather be a horse than an elk. And the horses, I think, were okay with that, but the people who owned the horses, they were not okay with that. So we ended up having to move him. And so I got tagged because I had the right skill set to help do those kinds of things. And so I did research, but I also did a bunch of sort of team management stuff. And this map just shows those yellow stars are different elk herds that I actually led formal research projects on. One place there were two projects that didn't overlap in time. And so I got to, it was a really cool thing. I got to do research on most of the elk herds in the state of Washington eventually. The two blue stars are not projects I led, but they were collaborations that I had with the National Park Service on elk work at Mount Rainier and elk work at Olympic National Park. Then the little green star, we'll talk about it in a minute. That's some moose stuff that I got involved in. And so I was just kind of going all the time, different places. Had to rely a lot on local support, local biologists in these various parts of the states who would partner with me. I'd lead the project and sort of hands-on a lot of stuff, but then a lot of the more routine day-to-day stuff, these other folks I would rely on, and they were doing a great job. And one of the things when you do large mammal work like this, that you end up doing, as Alinda alluded to, is there's a lot of useful things aviation can do for you. And so over the course of my career, particularly before the advent of things like GPS radio collars, when you just really had to go find animals, small helicopters, small light airplanes, I have no idea how many hours I spent in those things, but a lot. I could have gotten licenses to fly either both, but I didn't. So we did, things like capturing an elk with helicopters, but we also did, again, before the advent of GPS collars, you had to track things. So hang a collar on something, but you only knew where it was when you went out and found it, just using sort of rudimentary radio tracking techniques. But one of the tools we would do is we would hang antennas on airplanes like this. This is a Paul M7, which was a really cool plane for this kind of work. And if you can see on the wing strut, there's there's an antenna mounted on that wing strut. There's also an antenna mounted on the other wing, on its wing strut. And certain protocol that we can use, I won't go into the detail, but we would do a lot of tracking. I was flying and relocating these collared animals on a weekly basis for a long time, long part of my career. We'd also could do it with a helicopter. Tracking is different in a helicopter and an airplane. An airplane can't ever be stationary. It's always moving forward. So radio track differently from a helicopter that can stop, spin around in one spot. Like it's different. So that's another different antenna mount on a helicopter. But I ended up doing a lot of this aviation stuff. There's quite a bit in the book about how we used aviation and sort of the challenges, the dangers. I lost friends doing this same kind of work. But anyway, I think, if that interests you, I think you'll find some pretty cool stuff in the book about that. We ended up doing for ungulates like elk and deer. A lot of the capture work is in the winter. They're on the winter range. It's usually more open. They're more concentrated. So we do a lot of work in the winter, and it's challenging. And weather's challenging. The elements are challenging. I mean, I flew around in helicopters with the doors off when it was below zero. Like that's the coldest I've ever been in my entire life. This is a shot of us landing in a snowstorm at Mount St. Helens on a day we were capturing elk. We actually put a dart in this cow elk that I'll show you in a second in the sun. And this photo is of us bringing a couple of our crew members in to help me after the snow squall came up and it got pretty intense. And about 10 minutes later, the elk that we had darted was covered in snow, as was everything else. We ended up being grounded there for, 45 minutes maybe, while the snowstorm sort of got itself done. And then the sun came out again and we continued on. So you just had to do a lot of this, make it up on the fly, adjust, just make it work. Couldn't always have a beautiful day from the morning to the afternoon to do the work. Like there just wasn't enough days like that. So we weren't foolhardy, but we just kind of adapted, and did whatever we needed to do. I mentioned the moose thing. So one of the things I got to do was, I wasn't a moose researcher. That wasn't part of my job description, but this project started up in Northeast Washington and they needed to get some collars on some moose. And so they said, hey, we need somebody who can shoot a dart out of a helicopter and hit something. Like, could you do that for us? So I ended up getting approval to do that. And so I went up and helped them get this moose project started. Darting moose is a lot different than darting elk. Elk often are in big groups. Moose are almost never in big groups. Moose in Northeast Washington, There's not a lot of open ground. They're very temperament-wise, they're very different. Moose are very bold, like, we're in charge kind of animal. And like with an elk, you could dart an elk and then you could move it around with the helicopter to wherever you wanted it to go or it fell over. A moose would let you do that once or twice, and then it would not do anything that you wanted it to do after that, just not cooperate. So it was very interesting to me to see the differences in the temperament of the animals and how that affected what we were able to do. Again, I didn't do this work by myself. I had a lot of people that were partners, and most of our projects in the field looked like this. It would be me, and there would be some other local people. The woman in the orange jumpsuit there, the flight suit, is Kristen Mansfield. She's still the department's wildlife veterinarian. I did a lot of work with her and a preceding wildlife veterinarian, so I collaborated with a lot with them. And so, yeah, this wasn't just my story. This was a lot of teamwork. So on the lighter side, so in fall of 2013, Kim and I went, for the first time ever, we went to Hawaii. And we went to Hawaii. We decided to do it at big. We were there for 3 weeks. We decided we'd do the helicopter tour. So we booked a helicopter tour, flew around the island of Hawaii in an MD 500 with the doors off. I'd done a lot of that. Kim had never done that. And we had a good time. We landed and got talking to the pilot who had flown us. And I knew when I got home, like within about a week, I was supposed to go do this moose capture work. And I told him about it. And he said, "Well, that sounds really interesting." And I said, "Well, give me your email and I'll send you a photo from the work when we do it." So, "Oh, that'd be great." So out there in the field, somebody took this picture of me. So if you know, so the hand signal for aloha, why is this? Does anybody know what this is in American Sign Language? It's "I love you." So I sent a picture of myself with a moose to a helicopter pilot I barely knew with the message, "I love you." And I didn't realize that at first. It was several days after I'd sent this that I realized, oh, kind of messed that up. I never did hear back from him how he felt about me. But it was kind of a funny story. We all the folks in our crew kind of thought that was pretty funny. The picture on the right, so the story is in the book. This photo is not in the book. So on this particular project, we were trying to recapture collared elk periodically and do some body fat measurements and some data on them. And so we were flying around one day, we saw this herd elk, we saw what we thought was one of our collared elk. We started to go chase it, and lo and behold, it wasn't a collar around its neck. It was actually a toilet seat. And we were all a little puzzled by that, but we decided, heck, we're out here anyway, let's do something about this. So I popped her in the butt with a dart, and we exchanged the toilet seat for a more respectable radio collar for her. But that whole story is actually in the book too. So one of the other things, just by chance of my age and when I came to be a wildlife biologist, I landed in a time when, 1979 I started college, 1982 I started my master's degree. Nobody had a computer on their desk. Nobody. Like if you wanted to do a computer thing, you went to a lab on a university like this and worked with a computer that was bigger than a freezer, mainframe. And the picture at the top there, I don't know if people recognize that thing with the little dots on it, but that's a computer punch card. And that's how you gave commands back in the day to a computer. So the point of this slide is that over the span of my 40-year career, there was so much that changed. Like the evolution of technology, tools, even ethical codes for doing research on wild animals, that all just changed enormously. And I have a chapter in the book that really kind of walks through all these things that changed. Satellites became a tool, eventually connecting to radio collars, even the drugs, the bottom right corner, The drugs were really primitive when the Craigheads started their grizzly bear work. They were still pretty primitive when I started doing my elk work. But over 4 decades, there was a lot of advancement in better drugs for doing this kind of wildlife capture work. So it's kind of, I just thought it was a pretty interesting thing to sort of highlight and kind of walk through just how much it changed in one person's life, professional lifetime. It was enormous. So I feel like I was really fortunate. I got to do a lot of really cool things. I got to have the career that I thought was the right fit for me. Had a lot of support at home for doing it, and I got to go a lot of places and just do things that most people don't get to do. And it was really great, and that's kind of cover to cover what's in the book, that whole stuff. And I would be remiss to not acknowledge Kim, who's sitting in the audience here today, my wife, who has been just a tireless, always there supporter and encourager. And I couldn't have done all these things without her support and just being there. And I really appreciate that. So I just wanted to have a shout out to her. And with that, I will take any questions. Sure.
On your dart gun, I see that basically they're iron sights, which means to me that it's going to be a short range. What is the range of a dart gun?
Yeah, the really the limitation is the dart. So the dart has pretty poor ballistics compared to a bullet. And so the early dart guns, the ones that Craigheads were using, the ones I started using, were really modified single shot shotguns. And they were fired, the dart was fired from the single shot shotgun with a 22 blank, just like a construction worker uses in a nail gun. And you can get those in different power settings, and you can get the distance. But the trick was always with that gun is if you have a high powered charge in the gun, you can shoot the dart a long way. But if the animal you try to shoot at is close to you, you're going to hit it really hard, harder than you want. So the accuracy of the guns, especially early on, were probably 30 yards. You could do pretty well. Shooting from a helicopter, we were usually 10 yards or less. And so it wasn't such a big deal. Eventually, newer dart guns came out that were powered with CO2 or some other gas propellant. Lighter darts, the darts got better. And so, but yeah, anything, you could push a dart out to 40 or 45 yards, but your percentage of misses would be a lot higher than if you could keep it 30 or under.
Didn't the turbulence make a lot of difference?
It really didn't. It didn't. It shoots pretty fast through that little window of time, and again, being so close, that I didn't ever really notice having to compensate for that, and neither did the pilot. But I used to kid the pilot that my job was to shoot the dart, his job was to chase the elk in front of it. So, but yeah, the guns got better, the darts got better, the whole system got more efficient.
So in that same vein, like, how do you figure out the dosage of what you're gonna shoot them with, and how long does that last? I mean, how long is the animal out?
Yeah, so it depends on the drug, on how long they're out, and I'm going to answer your question, but there's a lot more in the book that goes to your question that I would encourage you to look at. It's not ideal. Capturing wildlife like this, if you go to the vet school here, they're going to do a pre-sedation workup. The animal's going to be fasting. All these things that are designed to keep the animal's welfare intact. You don't have that here. Like, these animals probably have full bellies a lot of times. You don't know how much they weigh. You can tell a big one from a smaller one, but you don't know what that difference is. They're never, you don't have any idea about any pre-existing conditions that they have. You're blind to all that. So it's a little challenging. So what we normally do, like for elk, we would load doses for what we thought were typical adult weights. And we would just not shoot at anything that wasn't adult. We did have one project in the Blue Mountains where we were trying to capture little bulls, when they were about 10 months of age, because we wanted to measure some things that we needed them. We just needed them to be that age. So, so we had a lower dose. We would load the lower dose and shoot them at those guys. How long they would stay down. So that first drug that the craigheads used, and I actually used it a little bit on elk. Back in the 80s, it was pretty popular for elk. The drug called succinylcholine chloride. Trade name most people were using was Sequestrin. It's actually a drug used in human medicine. Doesn't do anything to the awareness. The brain is not affected. It's a muscle depolarizing agent, which basically makes them, their muscles stop working, they become temporarily paralyzed and land on the ground. You have to get the dose right, because if you get too much, you're going to paralyze the diaphragm muscles, and they can't breathe, and they're going to suffocate wide awake. Like, that's not what you want. And I never had that happen. And so that was a pretty primitive drug. It had a lot of qualities that were not what you'd want, but it was the only thing there was out there initially. Nobody was spending money to figure out what were good wildlife drugs. Like, there wasn't a market for that much. But as time went on, better drugs came on. Narcotics became kind of for ungulates like deer, elk, moose, bighorn sheep, mountain goats. Those became the drugs of choice, and those drugs are reversible. So the animal will stay down as long as you want it to. And then when you're ready for it to be up again, you give it a shot of a reversal agent. And anywhere from 30 seconds to 3 minutes, they're back on their feet, looking around, running off into the woods. And that was, that was a nice thing to happen. Plus, it was a complete central nervous system depressant. So the animals were out, they didn't feel pain, they didn't feel stress. But the drugs that became popular on bears were actually drugs that were known on the street as angel dust, PCP. It was called Sertraline when it was a veterinary drug. It was eventually, it left the market because of abuse and DEA saying, we're done with that drug. We're not going to license it for anybody for any reason anymore. But it was a really great drug for bears. And it was a certain central nervous system depressant. We put them out. It didn't have a reversal agent. You have a while longer. Sequestrin was one of the things, a couple of things were nice about Sequestrin. It was really cheap. The other thing was that it had spontaneous arousal, and it was usually pretty short. So if I shot an elk with Sequestrin and it fell over, 30 minutes from now, it's going to be off running again full speed, no matter what I do. With the narcotics, if I shoot a dart in an animal and I lose it in the trees and I can't find it, it's going to stay down a long time. It could die. Sequestrin, on the other hand, you lose track of the animal or can't get to it in time, it's going to be up again and running away before you find it. So there were just kind of ups and downs of most of these drugs. But the way it's used, Sequestrin, the way it's used in human medicine, it's used for, because it paralyzes the muscles, it's used for intubations. It stops spasms in the pharynx, and it's also used a little bit it has been used in electroconvulsive shock therapy. The same thing, to prevent spasms. But the doses are really different for different animals. It takes a lot more Sequestrin to paralyze anything in a human than it does in an elk. Elk are really, they don't have the right enzyme. So anyway.
Was there ever a time where you felt, where you were fearful for where you were with the wild animal? Or did you feel threatened by any of the animals?
Well, I tell a story in the book about when I was working with Bruce McClellan in the North Fork. One of the things we were doing regularly was going out and finding poop from collared animals, and we would get food habits data from them. And this one day we'd been tracking this one grizzly bear in this big burn in this one area, and we were kind of waiting for her to move on so we could go and look for her poop. And so one day we went up there, turned on the telemetry, didn't hear her beeps. Like, okay, she's left. We can go hoof it around in here and see what we can find. So he and I split up, had an agreement to meet back at the car in an hour. And so I went off one direction, he went off another. I said, "Oh, what's my watch?" I found a few coops, bagged them, and started heading back to where I thought the truck was. And again, this was an old burn, so there weren't any really mature trees left. It was all shrubs and stuff. And I was almost to the road cut, and I knew the truck was just to my right, and I heard these footsteps on the road. And I thought that was probably Bruce, that he just beat me up there. And so I took another step forward. And in front of me, about the distance to where Kim is right now. So that's, I don't know, what is that, 15 feet, maybe? A little over 10 yards, I don't know. I looked up, and a grizzly bear stood up on its hind leg and looked me right in the eye. And it was a very unnerving experience. My knees just went. And there was no tree to climb, and the only thing close to a tree was right at the road cut where there were a few things, but that was in her direction. I wasn't going in her direction. And so she went back down on all fours, and I couldn't see her then. And I was just like, whatever happens in the next 5 or 10 seconds is going to be part of my life story. It either ends here today or it doesn't. And I didn't know what was going to happen. And then all of a sudden I could hear her hitting the brush on the other side of the road, taking off. So I turned around and I yelled really loud for Bruce, and apparently he could tell by how I yelled that I wasn't in a good spot mentally. And so he came racing up the hill, and we went up on the road where she had been, and I'd seen her, and we walked around, and he kind of got down on the ground and looking at this, looking at Pretty soon he says, "Come here." He says, "Well, you know what that is?" And I looked down and like some marks of it. He says, "Those are cub tracks. That was a sow with cubs of the year that you just ran into at 10 yards, and she backtracked. You're a lucky guy." So that was one I remember. The scariest time I ever had in the helicopter was at Mount St. Helens. We were doing surveys, not captures. And we were having one of those weeks with the weather that we were chasing good spots to work around this landscape we were working on. And it's one day we went out and got our survey done in the area we were trying to do, but then we were going to try to fly back to the fuel truck where the trucks were. To do that, we needed to get over a ridge. And so we started flying towards this ridge, and it started snowing harder, and started snowing harder. And pretty soon, we never would fly where we couldn't see some reference of the ground. Like our pilot just said, that we won't ever do that. But it was pretty dicey, and we were sneaking up this hill really slowly in the helicopter. And we got almost to the top, and I think about the same time, I think we all realized this isn't going to work. And right at that moment, I looked out my door, and I don't know if you know anything about logging, but there are logging infrastructure called cable logging rigs. So they're basically big towers that have a cable that runs down, and the fall trees, and they hook them up to that cable, and they pull them up the hill with that cable. I looked out my door, and like 10 yards away, I could see just the shadow of this tower of a helicopter logging rig. And I didn't know where the cables were. None of us did. And I told Jess, like, we got to back out like now. And we did. We kind of turned around, and as we went downhill, the visibility got better, and we ended up just going to the Longview Airport and had truck people come and get us. But that was one that I remember thinking, that was close. Yeah.
Do you have any research questions that keep you up at night, or wish you had time to look at?
So one of the things that lay people think you should always know is exactly how many animals there are, or whatever. Hunters want to know how many elk there are. Foresters want to know, how many, whatever there are. And it's a really difficult problem. The math really tough, because with any kind of detection system, you don't see them all. And so the holy grail is detection. If you can get a measure of detection, an estimate of detection, then you can turn any kind of survey result into an actual mathematically formal estimate. And so I think for a lot of us, that was something that our brains were always kind of focused on like that. Is there anything we haven't thought of? Is there a better way to do this? It's not a matter of just jumping in a helicopter, flying around, counting elk and clear cuts around Mount St. Helens and knowing how many elk are at Mount St. Helens. This doesn't work like that. Really smart people have worked on this for a really long time, way smarter people than me. I knew some of them, I talked to them, a lot of them. But I think that whole realm of quantification of abundance is one that I just always felt like, gosh, I wish we could do better. I wish we knew. But I talked to some people that like thought I was stupid because I couldn't tell them how many elk were in this particular drainage or road system. Like, I mean, foresters used to say that to me, and I'm like, so you estimate how many trees are out there before the sale, and then and how many you're going to remove, and then at the end how many you did. Like that number's never the same. And those trees don't go hide anywhere. Like you're telling me I'm supposed to be able to get the exact number. So anyway, I love my forester friends, but anyway, it's challenging. So yeah, that one we're still not there. DNA helps. DNA techniques are really the best, but there's some pretty gnarly things to deal with in DNA too.
In the 40s, 50s, 60s, even in the 70s, the vast majority of deer in the Elkhorns, the Blue Mountains, the Wallowas, Umatilla were mule deer. And now it seems that I haven't hunted since the mid-70s, but now it seems that all the mule deer are gone, and it's now whitetails and other mixes. And I remember in the 50s and into the 60s, in January and February, you'd go out and you'd see hillsides with 500 mule deer on in that season. But what caused that major change? That's to me seems to have happened.
So that's a really good question. So if you go into the literature, one of the things you'll find is about the 60s, west-wide, there was this big decline in mule deer. And there were a lot, it wasn't just in one state, like it didn't matter what state you looked at. And there were, people came up with theories of why that was, but it was nobody really ever, I think, had an answer that everybody agreed with why that happened. Mule deer and white-tailed deer are a little different ecologically, and so sometimes habitat change can. White-tailed deer do a lot better in kind of open country. Our whitetails are a little different than like eastern whitetails, but so there's probably some habitat changes that might have favored whitetails in some places over mule deer, that kind of thing. But there are a lot of theories, and there's been more than one of those events. So the 60s was a really notable one that everybody said, "Yeah, our mule deer are down too." Yeah, so are ours. And there just wasn't an easy answer to that. Mule deer are still kind of down now in Washington, for example. Whitetails. I went to high school in Darby, Montana, which is the Bitterroot Valley. And when I was in high school, once in a while you would see a white-tailed deer in somebody's pasture or something like that. We still have family over there, so we go back all the time. Right now, you can drive from Darby to Missoula, which is a little over an hour, and you'll probably see 300 white-tailed deer in various pastures, sometimes in people's yards. There are so many more whitetails now in western Montana, the Bitterroot, when I'm speaking to, than there was back in the 70s, say. But it's a tough nut to crack. But you're right. I think your observations are correct.
And there were previous previous events where the mule deer died.
Yeah, and I mean, nobody knows that it's totally dying either. Like there could be reproduction. there was just this trend in mule deer numbers that, you know, I mean, you could probably, some people would probably say it was sun flares, you know, I don't know. I mean, it was one of those so weird, like, don't think any theory is too weird, just tell us what you think. And there were a lot of theories, but
Well, the number of deer changed so abruptly from the 1920s, 30s, 40s, 50s, that all of a sudden this, it used to be you talk to people, you know, how was hunting? And they said, well, we didn't say anything. That when you talk to people from the 40s, 30s,
Right.
40s, and 50s, then all of a sudden in the 60s, as I said, 500 deer on one hillside.
right,
And this wasn't just one hillside, it was over there and over there, and they were everywhere. And then all of a sudden, because I quit hunting in the 70s because the military and all kinds of other things were more interesting, or more remuneration at that point. And so I kind of lost track of it. But my son, who's still in Eastern Oregon, says, no mule deer.
yeah, that's kind of the read in Washington too. So the reason Bill Bradley got that money to do a Klickitat deer study was because the Klickitat deer, which those deer, they're probably a hybrid of mule deer and blacktail. They really look strongly like blacktails, but they're pretty big. They're bigger than the coastal blacktail. The reason he got that money was because from everything that people had as data at the time, they had just about bottomed out for their historic abundance. Like, they were in trouble. And the tribe really depended on those deer. And so they wanted somebody to figure this out. So he was able to get the BIA to give them some money to try to figure this out. And so we did that work, like I said, for 6 or 7 years. And during that time, you know, there were some management changes that were made to kind of try to reduce mortality. And we really did see the Klickitat deer rebound. We had a pretty robust aerial survey protocol that we would do every spring. And at the beginning of that project, you know, we would fly for 2.5 hours on this survey area and probably see, I don't know, 600 deer maybe. At the end of that project, we fly that same amount of time in that same area, and we were pushing 2,000 deer observations. And so that population had really started to rebound. What had caused that decline and put him in that, it's debatable, but.
Well, I want to say thank you to Scott. And he's, as he's pointed out, there's a lot of great stories that he didn't cover in his book. And he's happy to tell you more and sign books if you'd like to take one home. But I'd like to thank Scott and his wife Kim for being here today and sharing these great stories with us. So thanks very much.